In this video, we're going to look at solubility rules, and this will help you finding out whether a salt produced from a reaction is going to be soluble or not, so whether a precipitate is going to be formed. There are some rules when memorizing the solubilities of salts, and that makes it easier to remember. So all nitrates are soluble, and I like to remember it by thinking about some uses for your nitrates, and some uses are fertilizers. So your ammonium and potassium nitrates are fertilizers, and that means they need to be soluble, so the plants can uptake them through the roots, so they can dissolve in water and the plants uptake them. Your chloride, most of your chlorides are soluble, and again, your salts are things that we can, some of them we can ingest, like sodium and potassium salts, sodium and potassium chlorides we can ingest. So most of them are soluble, except for your lead and your silver. And lead chloride was actually used for paint in the olden days, but it's poisonous, so they don't use it anymore. It's been banned. You'll see a picture of that. And silver is used for pottery glazing, and you'll see a picture of that. And I like to remember, these help me remember it. Your sulfate, they're mostly soluble, and besides four, which you need to know these four, and lead and silver again, they're pretty much all insoluble except for your lead and silver nitrates. But on the other hand, they are all insoluble, so that they're quite easy to remember. Your barium sulfate, that's used in medical tracing. It's called a barium meal, and you'll swallow it, and then you can trace your insides using an X-ray, because the X-ray is blocked. So you'll see a picture of that in a moment. And your calcium sulfate, that's used in making plasters, like casts. So like plaster of Paris, and things like that. So that's another way you can remember. Look, carbonates, a popular carbonate is calcium carbonate, and that is used in rocks, in limestone. So if you go around London, you see the white buildings around London, and they are made up from calcium carbonate. So if they were soluble, those buildings wouldn't really last long. Those beautiful white buildings. So I like to think, so they are mostly insoluble, and that's how I like to remember it. Hydroxides, I've got no way of memorizing this for you, sorry, but all of your hydroxides are insoluble, apart from barium. So barium is mostly soluble, except for your sulfate, which is used in medical tracing, and your carbonate, which you can just remember by rocks. And then your calcium hydroxide, that's actually lime water. So that just takes, you've got to shake that a bit for it to dissolve. But here you can also see that all ammonium, potassium, and sodium salts are also soluble. So that's another rule, and we'll look through those in a moment. So lead compounds used to be used, historically they've been used as paints, used to paint wooden frames and walls with them. If they were soluble, then they wouldn't be very good paints. So that's one way you can remember. It's one way you can remember them. They also used to be used as makeup, but that was poisonous, and that caused like this hair loss here, and amongst many other problems as well. Silver compounds can be used as pottery glaze. If they were soluble, then they wouldn't serve their function as pottery glaze, so that can help you remember. So we have some sulfates here, and if you can remember, most of your sulfates are soluble, except for your calcium sulfate, which can be used to make casts, and your barium sulfate, which can be used in medical tracing of the gastrointestinal system. Your other two sulfate compounds are your lead sulfate and your silver sulfate. So we can write our solubility rules into a table. And as you can remember from our previous topics, that salts are made up from cations, which are positively charged, and your anions, which are negatively charged. Most of these are actually negatively charged, but these are positively charged. So sodium, potassium, and ammonium, all salts of these, can you remember, are they soluble or insoluble? They're actually all soluble. So nitrates, again, can you remember? They're all soluble. Chlorides, they're all soluble except for, so most are soluble except for, can you remember, lead and silver? And that's just because, and you can remember that by your lead being your paints and silver being your pottery glazes. Sulfates, most of them are soluble, except for, again, your lead and silver. Then there's two more that you need to remember, and that's your plaster of Paris, or your casts, and then your barium meal. And so barium and calcium, and then lead and silver. Your carbonates, they're mostly rocks, so they're going to be insoluble most, except for your sodium, potassium, and ammonium. And then your hydroxides, again, these are going to be mostly insoluble, except for your sodium, potassium, and ammonium, of course. And then there's two exceptions that you need to know is barium and calcium. Calcium being your lime water, and barium, that you just have to know. I think that one's probably the hardest one to know. So we'll just go through your rules again, and we'll just go through which ones are soluble first, just because you'll be using these rules in the quiz next. So your soluble compounds, all sodium, potassium, and ammonium, all nitrates. I like to remember it by fertilizers. And your chlorides, most soluble, I like to remember it by, they're the edible ones. So potassium and sodium are edible chloride salts, except for your paint and your silver and your lead, which are paint and pottery glaze. Your sulfates, again, they're soluble except for your lead and silver, of course, and then your barium and your calcium, which your barium is used for medical tracing. Calcium is used for casts. That is partially. Calcium is one of those ones which are partially. Calcium hydroxide and calcium sulfate are partially. Most of your carbonate rocks are insoluble, so we'll look at the insoluble ones now. So carbonates are insoluble except for sodium, potassium, and ammonium. I like to think about it as rocks. Most of your metal hydroxides are insoluble except for, again, your sodium, potassium, and ammonium. Barium and calcium, they're the only ones, the exceptions there that you need to know. And barium, I think, is the hardest one to remember. And then your calcium is your lime water. So you know that that's soluble, but it is partially. It doesn't dissolve very well. Your other rules that you can remember, which go across in that table, and your lead and silver compounds, which are at the bottom of your table, if you can remember, and they're insoluble except for your nitrates. Barium compounds are all soluble except for sulfate, which is your meal, and your carbonate, which rocks. And calcium compounds, they're insoluble partially except your nitrate and chloride. So we just start our quiz now. Can you write 1 to 10 in your book? And you're just going to write the name of the salt when I put it up, and then whether it's soluble or insoluble in brackets next to it. So ammonium carbonate. So these are all of your salts. Just if you just write them down, then write soluble or insoluble next to them. I would pause it now, and then have a think about also the rule that you used. So for example, the first one, ammonium carbonate, I'll give you this. It's soluble, and the rule I used is all ammonium compounds are soluble. Okay. Okay, so let's go through the answers. So soluble because all ammonium compounds are soluble. Lead nitrate is soluble because all nitrates are soluble. Silver hydroxide insoluble because all silver compounds are insoluble except for your silver nitrate. Or you could say all hydroxides are insoluble except for your ammonium, sodium, and potassium. Barium sulfate, that's your meal, so that's insoluble. Calcium hydroxide, that's lime water, that's soluble but partially. You have to give it a shake. Zinc chloride, that is soluble, and because all chlorides are soluble except for your lead and silver. Your copper sulfate, that's soluble. I mean, you should remember that because of your because you make that you make crystals of copper sulfate using neutralization, then filtration, and then evaporation. Aluminium carbonate, that is insoluble because most carbonates are insoluble. I remember it just as carbonate, the carbonate rock, the calcium carbonate, which is rock. Iron nitrate, that is soluble because all nitrates are soluble and all sodium compounds are soluble. I hope you got those right, and I hope this helped.